picture this. You are standing in the sweltering heat of the Egyptian sun, its white blaze reflecting off endless limestone blocks that rise into unfinished temple walls. The air is heavy, sweet with lotus blossoms carried by the Nile breeze, but beneath it lingers another odor, coppery, metallic, unmistakable, blood. The chanting of priests echoes across stone courtyards, their guttural invocations vibrating like insects inside your skull. This is Egypt, not as you have seen in glossy museums, but as it was in the age of Ramesses, 3,000 years ago, when kings walked as gods and their sexuality was the axis on which the entire cosmos was believed to turn. Before diving into these forgotten stories of sex, death, and divine obsession, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more unsettling journeys into the dark corners of human history, because what you are about to hear is not the Egypt of serene pharaoh statues, nor of gold masks smiling in eternal silence. It is the Egypt whispered about by Herodotus, by Strabo, and by fragments carved into tomb walls, a world where sex was ritual, where bodies were tools, and where the line between sacred purity and grotesque violation was not just blurred, but deliberately erased. The Egyptians understood the body not as private flesh, but as a vessel of cosmic energy. Blood, semen, menstrual fluid, these were not filth but fuel, potent essences through which the universe itself was believed to renew. When Atum, the first god, brought creation into being, he did so not by command but by masturbation, ejaculating the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut, into existence. This myth was not whispered in secret shame. It was carved into temple walls, recited in sacred hymns. It told Egyptians that sexuality was not sin, it was the engine of creation. But what happens when kings and priests decide that their own flesh must reenact that divine moment again and again? What happens when that duty spirals into obsession? Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, after traveling through Egypt, noted customs that horrified even his well-traveled eyes. He tells of embalming practices where women's corpses were withheld for days before being delivered to embalmers, because too often the bodies were violated in the workshop. Imagine that. A family grieving their daughter, delaying burial not for ritual purity, but to let her body decay enough to repel the embalmer's lust. To Egyptians, this was not only depravity, it was metaphysical sabotage. A defiled corpse could lose its chance at eternity, its car forever polluted. Necrophilia in Egypt was more than crime, it was cosmic terrorism. And yet, in the same sacred texts, we find Isis herself, the goddess of magic, mounting the corpse of her dismembered husband Osiris. His penis lost, eaten by fish, Isis fashions a substitute and, in the myth, conceives Horus from her union with a dead god. Necrophilia, then, was both the most abominable violation and, paradoxically, the holiest of acts. It was both pollution and resurrection. This paradox was never resolved. It seeped into the chambers of priests and kings, haunting every burial, every ritual. If the cosmos itself was born from a god's ejaculation, then the king's own semen was not private essence. It was the survival of Egypt. During the Nile's inundation season, pharaohs performed rituals where they masturbated on the riverbank, spilling seed into the waters as a magical insemination. To the Egyptians, the Nile was not just water, it was the body of a god, Hapi, and the pharaoh's emission was an offering that ensured fertile floods, harvests, and survival for millions. Picture this scene, priests standing in solemn rows, courtiers looking on, the king lifting his robe and performing the cosmic act. No laughter, no embarrassment. The act was divine statecraft, his erection as critical as any law or battle. But the darker edge of this sexual cosmology lay in the palace itself. Pharaohs were gods. Gods married their sisters, and so Ramses II, the so-called Great, married at least 3 of his own daughters after the death of his beloved Nefertari. Reliefs show Bintenath, his child, standing beside him not as princess but as great royal wife. Imagine the psychological horror. A girl raised to revere her father as a god suddenly declared to be his consort. To Ramses, this was not incest. It was ritual preservation of divine blood, the replication of Osiris and Isis. To the daughter, it was erasure her womanhood consumed to become a mirror of her dead mother, her father's grief made flesh. Anthropologically, this collapse of sacred and profane is what Claude Lévi-Strauss would call the annihilation of taboo. Incest, necrophilia, bestiality. For most cultures, these are the ultimate boundaries of horror. For the Egyptians, under divine logic, they could become the very pillars of order. The sacred was filth, the profane was holy. Every pharaoh's bedchamber, every embalmer's workshop, every temple ritual was conducted under this inversion, this terrifying axiom. If creation demands it, no boundary holds. Now consider the tombs. Archaeologists uncovering royal burials have often found crude figurines, wooden or clay men with grotesquely exaggerated erections, placed around the sarcophagus. For decades, scholars dismissed these as fertility charms. But read the coffin texts. Spells instruct Isis and Nephthys to arouse the dead pharaoh, to stimulate his penis so he might beget life even in death. These figurines were not charms, they were ritual tools. In the sealed dark of a tomb, priests and women of the royal house gathered, chanting spells while touching, handling, symbolically arousing the corpse of a king. The goal, to transfer his sexual potency into eternity, to ensure the line of Horus would continue. To us, it is necrophilic horror. To them, it was cosmic necessity. Every act of preservation contained the seed of violation. The embalming table was both surgical theatre and potential crime scene. The king's harem was both pleasure palace and ritual engine. The Nile's waters were both sacred and inseminated by human hands. Egypt thrived on this knife edge between sacred awe and grotesque desecration. And as Herodotus recorded, even their own people sometimes recoiled. That is why, he wrote, the bodies of noble women were allowed to rot before embalming. The horror was not hidden. It was lived, known, feared. This is only the beginning. The deeper you descend into Egypt's sexual cosmology, the more the line between godhood and grotesque dissolves, until every bed, every tomb, every flood becomes a stage for rituals that blur sex, death, and eternity into a single, unflinching nightmare. Imagine this: a chamber beneath a temple, lit only by flickering oil lamps. The walls are painted with images of gods in animal form: falcons, jackals, serpents, their eyes glowing gold in the unsteady light. In the center lies a limestone slab where a body has been stretched out, naked, still glistening with the oils of death. The air is thick with incense, meant to sanctify the space, but it cannot disguise the stench of decay. This is the embalmer's workshop, the waybit, the pure place. To the ancient Egyptians, this was the holiest of laboratories, where death was reversed, where flesh was preserved, where the ka and the ba, the soul's fragments, could be secured for eternity. And yet, here in this sanctum, the most obscene betrayals took place. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the process of mummification in detail. The body washed, organs extracted, cavities filled with resin and linen, the skin coated with natron salts, but in the same passage he records whispers of horror. Young women's bodies, especially those of highborn wives and daughters, were not entrusted to embalmers immediately after death. Families withheld them for 3 or 4 days. Why? Because embalmers were caught defiling the corpses. Necrophilia was not rumor, it was fact, confirmed by court cases, by confessions. A daughter's body, still soft, still beautiful in death, could be desecrated by the very men entrusted with her eternal safety. The horror for the Egyptians was not simply the violation of modesty, it was cosmic annihilation. A woman whose corpse was defiled risked losing her afterlife. Her car rendered polluted, her name erased in eternity. The contradiction was staggering. On one hand, necrophilia was the greatest imaginable crime against the dead. On the other hand, their central myth, the Osiris cycle, elevated an act of necrophilia to the highest holiness. Isis, unable to accept the loss of her husband Osiris, painstakingly reassembled his butchered body from fragments scattered across Egypt. One part was missing: his penis, eaten by fish in the Nile. And so, using magic, Isis fashioned a substitute phallus, mounted the corpse of her husband, and conceived Horus, the Avenger. Every Egyptian child grew up hearing this tale. Every priest carved it into stone. The mother of all dynasties conceived her son through union with a dead god, and so the most forbidden act was simultaneously the cornerstone of the sacred. Anthropologically, this paradox speaks to the Egyptian collapse of categories. Mary Douglas, in her work on purity and danger, argues that societies define filth as matter out of place. For Egypt, the corpse was not filth but a vessel. A body could be both holy and vile, an object of veneration and of desecration. Necrophilia was therefore not simply a moral transgression, it was a dangerous crossing of categories, a collapse of boundaries that threatened cosmic balance. And yet, their most beloved goddess performed it, sacralized it, and ensured that every pharaoh's tomb would echo it. Inscriptions from the pyramid texts and coffin texts are chillingly explicit. They speak of the king's penis rising in death, of Isis and Nephthys taking hold of him, stimulating him, ensuring his seed would pass into eternity. These are not vague metaphors. They are spells, direct instructions carved into stone. Archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered small wooden figurines, crude male forms with enormous erections, placed near sarcophagi. For decades, scholars avoided the subject. They labeled them fertility charms. But when read against the ritual texts, their meaning becomes unavoidable. They were tools, props for ritual necrophilia enacted symbolically or perhaps physically in the tomb itself. Now picture the scene as it might have unfolded. The king's body, wrapped in linen, lying in the sarcophagus. Priests in jackal masks chant guttural spells, the coffin texts recited in the torchlight. Royal women, perhaps wives or daughters, play the roles of Isis and Nephthys, keening, wailing, then touching the figurines, invoking the pharaoh's potency. They are instructed to raise him up, to restore his generative force. The act is necrophilic theatre, reenacting the myth of Osiris in the hope that the king too will rise, will father the next Horus in spirit. To us, it is obscene beyond comprehension. To them, it was salvation. And what of the living pharaoh? His sexuality was not private, it was a public utility, a national resource. The Nile's inundation was life itself. Too low meant famine, too high meant destruction. Each year, at the banks of the river, the king performed the most shocking of rituals. Chroniclers, both Egyptian and foreign, record the pharaoh's role. He would publicly masturbate, ejaculating into the Nile, a symbolic insemination of the river god Hapi. This was not theatre for commoners. It was a cosmic contract. If the pharaoh's semen was potent, the flood would be perfect, crops would grow, armies would triumph. Imagine the silence of a gathered court as the king exposed himself, the crowd watching not with prurient eyes but with terror. His erection determined the survival of millions. Here we see the full collapse of sacred and profane. What in another culture would be hidden, shamed, even criminal, was in Egypt divine duty. The pharaoh's body was not his own. It was an altar, a cosmic tool. His semen, his erections, his daughters, his wives, even his corpse, all were instruments of statecraft, of magic, of survival. But the horror intensifies with the incest of kings. Ramesses II, the great conqueror, elevated his daughters to queenship after the death of his beloved wife Nefertari. Bintenath, his eldest daughter, stood beside him in reliefs as great royal wife. Later, Meritamen and Nebatawi followed. To modernize, these are acts of incest, a father marrying his own children. But for Egyptians, this mirrored the gods themselves. Atum created the first divine siblings from his semen. Geb the earth married Nut the sky, his own sister. Osiris and Isis were brother and sister. For the pharaoh, marriage to his daughter was not violation, it was divine replication. Imagine the psychological violence. A princess raised from birth to worship her father as god, now ordered to be his wife. She dons her mother's jewels, takes her mother's titles, and in ritual embraces becomes the vessel through which her father reenacts the divine incest of Isis and Osiris. She is erased as daughter, reborn as consort. To the state, she is sacred. To us, she is consumed, her body rewritten by her father's grief and ambition. Anthropologists describe incest in divine kingship as god logic. The king must embody the gods broke taboos, therefore the king must too. The profane became necessary. What horrifies us was their proof of legitimacy. The line of Horus had to remain pure, and purity demanded violation. This cycle of sacralized filth, of incest and necrophilia, extended deep into private life. Magic spells discovered on papyri speak of sexual coercion through sorcery, men invoking spirits of the restless dead to force women into love, using semen and menstrual blood as magical weapons. A man might pierce a wax doll of a woman with copper needles, cursing her to desire him alone. The line between sex and violence, between intimacy and sorcery, was erased. Even ordinary Egyptians lived in this world of sacred violation, where the body was never private, never safe, always permeable to gods, ghosts, and curses. The Egypt we see in glossy textbooks, golden masks, solemn statues is a carefully sanitized version. The reality was a civilization built upon a sacred contract that demanded the most terrifying of sacrifices: the exposure of the body, the violation of taboos, the sanctification of incest and necrophilia. Their glory was not separate from their horror, it was made of it. And the consequences of this worldview were profound. For millennia, it bound Egypt together, but it also planted seeds of paranoia, of taboo, of practices so grotesque that even their own chroniclers recorded them in tones of disgust. Picture this: the Valley of the Kings at dusk. The cliffs glow red under the dying sun, the air dry as parchment. Deep inside a newly sealed tomb, torches sputter in a chamber packed with mourners, priests, and officials. The king is dead, but the rituals of resurrection have only begun. To the Egyptians, this is not mourning as we know it. It is engineering an attempt to replicate the divine union of Osiris and Isis so the pharaoh may rise again. And at the center of this machine of eternity is sexuality. The air is heavy with incense, but beneath the sweetness is the acrid odor of natron salts and slow-rotting flesh. Death, sex, and eternity mingle in one suffocating breath. The texts carved into the chamber walls give direct instructions. The pharaoh's sexual power must be reawakened. His penis must be raised, his seed conjured, his potency restored. Spell 534 of the coffin text's commands. Raise yourself up, O king, for you have not died. Your son Horus has acted on your behalf. He makes your phallus stiff so that you may beget. Priests chant these words, their voices echoing in the suffocating dark. Figurines with grotesque erections are arranged around the sarcophagus, crude but potent tools meant to serve as extensions of the king's body. The royal women wail, their cries mimicking Isis and Nephthys. This is not grief, it is ritual stimulation. They weep, they touch the effigies, they arouse the corpse of their father, their husband, their god. To us, it is necrophilic theatre. To them, it is the machinery of rebirth. Outside these tomb rituals, the same cosmology played out in the open. Each year, when the Nile began its inundation, the pharaoh walked to the riverbank. Surrounded by priests, he exposed himself and ejaculated into the water. The scene described in temple inscriptions was not symbolic, it was explicit. The semen of the king inseminated Hapi, the river god. The Nile's flood was the womb, the king's emission the seed. If he performed successfully, Egypt survived. If not, famine loomed. Imagine the silence of the assembled court. No laughter, no embarrassment. A nation's survival depended on a single act of public masturbation. The pharaoh's potency was the hinge of the cosmos. Anthropologically, this ritual reveals Egypt's fusion of cosmic and biological cycles. The river was the bloodstream of the land, semen its fertilizer. Fertility was not metaphorical but literal, engineered by ritual sex between man and God. The act blurred every boundary, between public and private, king and commoner, sacred and obscene. What should be hidden became the center of state ceremony. It was not the king's choice, it was his duty. His erection was a political event. Inside the palace, the logic grew darker. After the death of his great wife Nefertari, Ramses II elevated his daughters to queenship. Bintanath, Meritamun, Nebetawi daughters transformed into wives. Reliefs depict them standing beside their father, wearing crowns once worn by their mother. These were not symbolic gestures, they were enacted marriages. The daughters became great royal wives, participants in ritual unions meant to mirror divine incest. The gods had married their siblings, the pharaoh must do the same. Consider the psychological horror. A girl raised to revere her father as God is suddenly told she will now replace her dead mother, sharing her father's bed, wearing her mother's jewels. Her identity collapses. She is not daughter, not princess, but consort, a vessel for divine continuity. Anthropologists describe this as God logic. If the gods did it, the king must too. What is incest to mortals becomes sacred imitation when performed by a god-king. But behind the ritual logic lies unbearable silence. Daughters erased, their womanhood consumed by dynastic necessity. Even later dynasties embraced this pattern. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers who adopted Egyptian tradition, married brother to sister for centuries. Cleopatra herself was the product of generations of incestuous unions. To Greeks, this was scandalous. To Egyptians, it was proof of divine legitimacy. The royal bloodline was a closed loop, purified not by mixing but by violation. The gods created through incest, the pharaohs must replicate them. The sacred was filth, the profane was law. But Egypt's sexual cosmology extended beyond incest and necrophilia. Herodotus records the festival of Mendes, where the ram god Benebjedet was worshipped. In this cult, a living ram was venerated as a god. During public festivals, sources describe women coupling with the sacred animal in front of crowds. To modern minds, this is unimaginable. To Egyptians, it was the union of divine and human, a cosmic marriage that infused the land with fertility. Strabo, the Roman geographer, confirms these reports centuries later, writing with revulsion at the public spectacle. The woman was not degraded in their eyes. She was honored, temporarily elevated as consort of the god. The act we label bestiality was, to them, communion. Imagine the scene. Drums pound, incense smokes, the crowd roars. A woman adorned in jewels and perfumed oils is led to the sacred ram. Priests chant as she submits to the living god. No shame, no secrecy. This was theater of creation, fertility incarnate. To the crowd, it was assurance that crops would grow, livestock would multiply, and Egypt would thrive. Anthropologically, this represents the absolute collapse of boundaries between species, between divine and animal. The Egyptians reduced creation to its raw mechanics and reenacted it in public. The horror for us was their salvation. Even in private life, sexuality was weaponized. Magical papyri describe spells to coerce desire. A rejected lover might fashion a wax doll of his target, inscribe her name, and pierce it with copper needles. He would chant curses. I pierce your mouth so you speak only of me. I pierce your womb so you desire only me. Menstrual blood, semen, spittle, all were collected as magical ingredients. To Egyptians, these fluids were not waste but raw power. Love itself was a battlefield of sorcery, where consent dissolved under the weight of curses. Ordinary people lived in constant fear that a lock of hair, a drop of sweat, could enslave them through magic. Thus, the same logic that compelled pharaohs to inseminate the Nile and daughters to marry fathers extended to peasants and scribes. The body was never private. Every fluid, every act, every corpse, every animal could be drawn into the machinery of cosmic survival. For 3,000 years, this worldview bound Egyptians to a cycle of sacred violation. Their glory and their horror were inseparable. The consequences were profound. These practices reinforced the authority of kings, linking their sexual potency to the stability of the state. They shaped family life, collapsing boundaries of kinship. They infused daily existence with paranoia, where desire itself was suspect. Egypt's monuments, its pyramids, its temples, its tombs are inseparable from this sexual cosmology. The same hands that carved statues of serene gods also carved texts instructing the arousal of dead kings. Their golden age was built upon rituals we now regard as grotesque beyond comprehension. But even among Egyptians, the unease was real. Herodotus's report of embalming crimes shows that some practices were seen as monstrous even then. Families feared embalmers, priests debated taboos, chroniclers recoiled at festivals. The paradox at the heart of Egyptian religion that the holiest acts could also be the most obscene haunted them as much as it horrifies us now. Picture this. The year is 332 BCE. Alexander the Great has marched his armies across the desert and entered Egypt. He is crowned as pharaoh at Memphis, proclaimed son of Ammon. For centuries, Egypt's sexual cosmology had gone unquestioned. Incestuous kings, necrophilic rites, ritual inseminations of rivers and animals, all had been upheld as divine duty. But now Greek eyes fall upon these practices, eyes shaped by different gods, different taboos, and they see not cosmic order, but monstrosity. What for Egyptians was sacred, for outsiders was obscene. And in that clash of perspectives, the seeds of Egypt's religious collapse were sown. The Ptolemies, Alexander's successors, adopted the pharaonic model of kingship. They married brother to sister in deliberate imitation of Isis and Osiris. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of them all, was the product of generations of sibling unions. Greek chroniclers in Alexandria recorded these marriages with unease. Their Hellenic ideals of the oikos, the household repulsed by incest, turned into dynastic policy. Yet the logic was the same as it had been for Ramses. The gods did it, therefore the king must. Anthropologically, this is the principle of mythic imitation. The ruler enacts divine acts, no matter how transgressive, to prove his godhood. Incest, the ultimate taboo for mortals, became the ultimate proof of divinity for kings. But incest was not the only horror preserved into the Hellenistic period. The tomb rituals continued. Inscriptions from later periods still speak of raising the pharaoh's phallus, of stimulating his potency in death. Figurines with grotesque erections are still found in Ptolemaic burials. Even as Greek and Roman writers recoiled, Egyptians clung to their cosmology. They could not abandon it, because their universe was built upon it. To stop enacting these rituals was to risk cosmic collapse. Consider the psychological consequences. For 3,000 years, Egyptian society lived under a contract that made their bodies porous, vulnerable, and weaponized. A drop of blood, a lock of hair, a spasm of semen, all could be harvested, cursed, used in sorcery. Papyrus spells show men and women begging gods to drive their lovers mad with desire, to blind them, to paralyze them until they submitted. One spell instructs a spirit to drag her by her hair, by her heart, by her genitals until she comes to me. Another commands that a rival's penis be bound, as stiff as the corpse of Osiris. This was not marginal magic, it was ordinary. To Egyptians, sexuality was a battlefield of spirits, a war fought with fluids and effigies. Mary Douglas's analysis of purity applies here with terrifying clarity. In Egypt, nothing was waste. Everything that left the body, blood, semen, menstrual fluid, spit, was power. The body was a leaky vessel, every opening a portal, every discharge a weapon. The anxiety this produced was immense. Families guarded the bodies of their daughters after death, terrified of embalmers. Husbands feared sorcerers stealing their wives' fluids. Wives feared rivals cursing their fertility. The body was never private. It was always vulnerable, always exposed to violation. The political consequences were equally profound. A king's potency was not his own concern. It was the concern of an empire. When he inseminated the Nile, he was ensuring floods, not pleasure. When he married his daughter, he was imitating gods, not indulging desire. But the effect was the same: private intimacy dissolved into public ritual. Anthropologists call this cosmic collectivization. The king's body belonged to the state. His erections were national resources. His daughters were extensions of dynastic machinery. The horror of incest and necrophilia was reframed as political necessity, and yet the tension was always present. Even Egyptians whispered of the dangers. Herodotus's account of embalmers violating corpses shows that families feared their sacred system could devour them. Strabo's description of the Mendes festival, where a woman copulated with a sacred ram, reveals Roman disgust. He describes it bluntly, without embellishment, as if even words could not capture the obscenity. The Egyptians themselves seem to have recorded little of these acts in direct terms. Reliefs are symbolic, texts couched in mythic language, but the archaeological record, figurines, papyri, ritual instructions, strips away euphemism. The horror is undeniable. By the time Christianity spread through Egypt in the 1st, 4th centuries CE, these practices were violently suppressed. The incestuous dynasties ended. Necrophilic resurrection rites were condemned as demonic. The public rituals of semen and blood were replaced by sacraments of wine and bread. What had once been the axis of the cosmos became, in the new faith, ultimate sin. The reversal was absolute. Where Egyptians had seen semen as sacred, Christians saw lust as corruption. Where Egyptians had seen incest as divine, Christians saw it as damnation. Where Egyptians had sanctified necrophilia, Christians condemned it as abomination. The cosmos was rewritten, and Egypt's dark sexual machine ground to a halt. But the shadow did not disappear. In rural Egypt, echoes of the old system survived in whispers. Folk magic continued to use hair, blood, and fluids as weapons of sorcery. The fear of corpses being violated lingered in funerary customs. Anthropologists studying modern Egyptian villages in the 19th century still found practices of keeping women's bodies guarded for days, a faint echo of the Herodotean fear. The memory of filth as sacred, of taboo as divine, endured like a ghost. What, then, are we to make of this? For 3,000 years, one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, builders of pyramids, creators of mathematics, masters of art and astronomy, lived by a sexual cosmology that sanctified what we now see as horrific. Necrophilia, incest, bestiality, coercive magic, these were not fringe perversions. They were the pillars of state, religion, and family life. Egypt's glory was inseparable from Egypt's horror. The anthropological lesson is stark. Categories we treat as absolute sacred and profane, purity and filth, body and soul, are not universal. They are constructs. Egypt inverted them. To them, filth was sacred, violation was creation, incest was legitimacy, semen was salvation. Their system worked. It sustained their civilization for millennia, but it came at a cost of unimaginable human suffering. Daughters consumed as wives, corpses desecrated in workshops, women paraded before animals, peasants cursed with effigies. Every life lived under the shadow of a body that was never safe, and when foreign eyes saw it Greek, Roman, Christian, they recoiled. What Egypt called sacred, the world called monstrous, and in that clash, Egypt's cosmology crumbled. Picture this: a museum basement in the modern world. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, sterile and indifferent. On a shelf lies a wooden figurine, small, crude, but unmistakable. A man carved with an oversized erection. For decades it sat in storage, labeled fertility charm. Now scholars read the inscriptions of the coffin texts, the pyramid texts, and suddenly the truth emerges. This object is not quaint. It is a relic of necrophilic resurrection, once placed beside a king's corpse to ensure his potency in death. What looks to us like grotesque pornography was, to ancient Egypt, the engine of eternity. The artifact radiates a horror more unsettling than gold masks or sarcophagi. It reminds us that one of history's most celebrated civilizations thrived on a sexual cosmology we struggle even to describe without revulsion. The story of Egypt's horrific sexual practices does not end in the sands of antiquity. Its consequences reverberate. For 3,000 years, Egyptians believed that the body was never private, never safe, always a vessel for cosmic forces. The pharaoh's semen inseminated rivers. His daughters became his wives. Corpses were ritually aroused. Animals were made divine partners. Ordinary people cursed and bound one another with bodily fluids. The body was porous, leaky, dangerous, weaponized. Every orifice a portal, every discharge a tool. This worldview bound Egypt together, but it also created paranoia, trauma, and violence woven into the very fabric of daily life. Herodotus, Strabo, and Plutarch serve as our horrified witnesses. They describe embalmers defiling corpses, women coupling with rams, incestuous marriages, and rituals that blurred every line of taboo. To them, these accounts were not just curiosities. They were warnings, recorded with a mixture of fascination and disgust. And in their writings we glimpse the universal question: how far will a civilization go to preserve itself? For Egypt, the answer was as far as necessary, even if it meant violating its dead, consuming its children, or collapsing every boundary between sacred and profane. The consequences were catastrophic. The incestuous dynasties of the Ptolemies produced rulers like Cleopatra, brilliant yet physically fragile, shaped by generations of inbreeding. The necrophilic resurrection rites horrified foreign observers, undermining Egypt's legitimacy in the eyes of Greeks and Romans. The public rituals of semen and blood became fodder for Christian condemnation, painted as proof of Egypt's corruption and pagan depravity. What had once been cosmic duty became historical shame, but to dismiss these practices as primitive would be a mistake. Anthropologically, Egypt demonstrates that the sacred can sanctify anything, even horror. When survival is tied to ritual, no act is too obscene. The pharaoh inseminating the Nile is obscene to us, but for them it was statecraft. A daughter marrying her father is abhorrent to us, but for them it was divine imitation. A corpse stimulated in its tomb is unthinkable to us, but for them it was resurrection. The sacred made the profane holy, and by that logic Egypt endured for millennia. And yet, there is a timeless warning here. When the body becomes the property of the state, when private flesh becomes public resource, horror follows. In Egypt, the king's semen was not his own. It belonged to the nation. His daughters' bodies were not their own. They belonged to dynastic necessity. A woman's corpse was not hers. It belonged to embalmers, priests, the machinery of eternity. Ordinary people's fluids were not private. They were weapons in sorcery. This erasure of bodily autonomy produced a civilization of staggering monuments, but also left behind echoes of trauma, fragments of horror that still unsettle us today. Look at the modern world. We pride ourselves on having escaped such obscenities. And yet, the logic lingers. The state still claims the body in times of war, drafting men to kill and die. Governments legislate reproductive rights, deciding who may or may not bear children. Corporations harvest genetic data, saliva, DNA, reducing the body to information, to commodity. We may no longer see semen as divine, but we see DNA as currency. We may no longer inseminate rivers, but we dump toxins into them as if they too are vessels to be filled. Egypt's horror is not as alien as we pretend. It is a mirror, dark and distorted, but recognizably human. In the end, Egypt's downfall came not from foreign invasion alone, but from its own contradictions. A system that sanctifies incest, necrophilia, and bestiality can endure, but only so long as its people believe. When Greeks and Romans arrived, their disgust cracked the illusion. When Christians imposed new taboos, Egypt's cosmology collapsed. The sacred could no longer justify the obscene. What had once been divine order was exposed as human horror, and so we return to the museum basement. The wooden figurine stares back with its grotesque erection, an artifact of belief and violation. It is not a relic of fringe perversion. It is a cornerstone of a world where sex, death, and eternity were bound together in ways we can barely comprehend. To hold it is to hold a fragment of a civilization's soul, a soul built on a bargain between gods and men that demanded the unthinkable. Picture again the embalmer's workshop, the Nile's banks, the Pharaoh's tomb. Hear the chants, smell the incense, feel the air thick with sweat and decay. This was Egypt, not the sanitized Egypt of textbooks, but the Egypt of flesh and fluids, of incest and sorcery, of necrophilia and cosmic desperation. A world where horror was holy, where filth was sacred, where bodies were consumed by a machine of eternity. The warning is clear. Whenever the sacred consumes the profane, whenever the state consumes the body, horror follows. Egypt shows us not how alien ancient humanity was, but how thin the boundary is between order and obscenity, between worship and violation. It is a boundary we must guard carefully, lest our own monuments, digital, political, scientific, be built on horrors no less profound than those carved into the tombs of the Nile. So as you leave this story, remember, the gold masks and pyramids are not the whole truth. Beneath them lies another Egypt, one of semen in rivers, daughters in beds, corpses in workshops, and gods demanding the unthinkable. That is the Egypt Herodotus whispered about, that Strabo recoiled from, that Christianity condemned. And it is the Egypt we must not forget, because it reminds us of what humans will sanctify in the name of survival. The story ends here, but the question remains. When belief can make the obscene sacred, what horrors in our own world are we already justifying as necessary, as divine, as inevitable? The Egyptians show us the price of such bargains. Theirs was 3,000 years of glory, and 3,000 years of horror entwined.